the Reading Hub Plenary Gender Balance in the Household and Workplace in the COVID Recovery. We welcome, of course, the in-person audience here at Reading and the virtual audience. You can all interact via the conference platform. You can do that both via chat and video calls. This is thanks to the virtual conference technology we have in place, though I'd be grateful if you didn't video call each other during this session. We are very fortunate to have a very exciting panel to discuss the topic. At Reading, we felt this should reflect our tradition of policy-relevant research. So we've organized a panel that has a keynote talk by a distinguished academic and a discussion led by policy experts. Let me introduce our keynote and panel members before handing over to them for this exciting session. So our keynote will be by Professor Barbara Petrongolo, who unfortunately has COVID, so she's joining us virtually and not in person. She's a professor of economics at the University of Oxford and a professorial fellow at Nuffield College. She's fellow of the British Academy, director of the CEPR Labour Economics Programme, and research associate also at the Centre for Economic Performance of the London School of Economics. She is also currently managing co-editor of the Economic Journal. She's worked extensively on the performance of labour markets with job search frictions, applications to unemployment dynamics, welfare policy, and interdependencies across local labour markets. Her work also researches the causes of gender inequalities in labour market outcomes, and this is what she's going to tell us a lot about today. Our panelists include, to my right, Ray Newton-Smith, Chief Economist at the Confederation of British Industry and a member of its executive committee. She leads economics and international teams with a focus on economic and tax policy, the transition to a low-carbon sustainable economy, and global business leadership. She and her team provide business leaders with advice on the UK economic outlook and global risks, helping to develop the economic policy response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Also on my right, Cristiano Cantore, research advisor at the Bank of England, reader in economics at the University of Surrey, and guest lecturer at the London School of Economics. Cristiano has an MSc from Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona and a PhD in economics from the University of Kent, and has conducted research for OECD, ECB, Bank of Spain, and has been a visiting professor at the University of California, San Diego. And finally, also at the very end of this table to my right, Giovanni Razzu, professor of public policy at the University of Reading. Before joining the university in 2012, he was a government economist in various departments, including Office of the Deputy Prime Minister, Cabinet Office, and Government Equalities Office. He's been lead analyst for the Independent Equalities Review and the UK representative on the expert group of the European Institute for Gender Equality. So, without further ado, let me hand over to Barbara Petrongolo for the keynote talk.
Thanks very much for this introduction, and thanks to Marina and all other organizers for inviting me to present at the RES Reading Hub. Also, special thanks for accommodating this talk online. I'm afraid this shows that the transition to the post-COVID world is not yet complete, and this is very much related to the topic of this panel. So I'm going to talk about COVID and gender. I will show some evidence, some recent evidence on gender inequalities during the pandemic, and also discuss what kind of lessons we can learn for the long run. This talk will be based on joint work with Pablo Garcia Guzman and Claudia Hupkau, both at CUNEF in Madrid. So I understand I have 30 minutes, right? Okay. So basically, since the pandemic arrived, one key question was how the new challenges were interacting with existing inequalities, with, of course, the potential to exacerbate some of them. And gender inequalities are a natural place to look into for various reasons. First of all, some of the sectors that were especially hit by lockdown or social distancing are female-dominated sectors with a lot of contact among like providers and consumers or among consumers. So, for example, retail, hospitality, etc. Now, partly offsetting this, critical sectors such, for example, as health and social care are also female-dominated. So this might work in the opposite direction. And the massive reorganization of work, both in the workplace and the household, implied, of course, massive strains on the time use of men and women, especially fathers and mothers. So there has been quite a bit of evidence from the past 2 years that has shown evidence of the unequal impacts of COVID on the time use, for example, of men and women. Now, to summarize briefly this kind of evidence, one very important contribution that was published right after the beginning of the pandemic was this work by Titan Alon, Matthias Döpeg, and Michel Tertlit on the US recession. And basically, the headline of this research was that this time things are different. They're different in the following way that, for example, if one looks at the major recessions that took place in the US in the whole post-war period, and one computes the unemployment differential between men and women, you can see that whenever on this chart you see negative numbers, these reflect to cases in which men had higher unemployment increases than women. So virtually all recessions were either gender neutral or had a much stronger impact on male employment rates. By contrast, the 2020 recession was completely unprecedented because it generated a large differential hitting women more strongly than men in unemployment. So this is very much what has led the authors to talk about the secession. So this evidence comes from the US. For the UK and for a bunch of other countries, there have been other surveys, mostly real-time surveys. So these were really like ad hoc surveys with relatively small samples that were carried out soon after the beginning of the pandemic. And they were extremely useful because they really provided very rich information on various aspects of work and family life affected by COVID. So there's been several papers in this literature, and basically one key message that came out of those papers is that women provided for the bulk of increased childcare needs when nurseries and schools closed in March 2020. And then later, gradually, also large representative surveys became available. So basically, these were like regular waves of the UK LFS or the ASHE for the UK, or COVID special waves or other large representative surveys like Understanding Society. So for example, Understanding Society has produced 9 special COVID waves at sort of monthly, bi-monthly frequencies that were especially valuable because they were serving the whole Understanding Society population, and the COVID responses could be linked to both baseline information on those respondents before COVID, and will be linked to sort of end-line information on ongoing surveys still for the same individuals. I have some work on the Understanding Society COVID surveys joined with Claudia Huckau. In that paper, we do find evidence of more nuanced views on gender inequalities during the pandemic, in the sense that the impact of the pandemic on labor market outcomes like hours and earnings were very similar across gender. What was relatively different was instead the time involvement in the household. So women were doing more unpaid work than men once the lockdown measures were in place. And also there has been other work on large data sets, for example, some work by Bell and co-authors based on administrative data, that again, also this paper offers a more nuanced view of the unequal impacts of the COVID pandemic. So again, the sort of title of this paper is really perhaps this time is not that different, because the categories of workers that are mostly really hit by the COVID recession, like unskilled workers, workers on temporary contract, precarious situations, and also for women, there isn't such a big difference. So perhaps things are not that different from other recessions, sorry. So what is kind of important to discuss now and to steer for the research is really what kind of open questions remain for the long-term consequences of COVID, and what can be learned in terms of lessons for the organization of work. So I will go to, in this talk, I'm going to talk about a brief picture on gender inequalities in general. The picture will be very brief, and I will mostly be touching upon the aspects that can be interesting to understand the impacts of the pandemic. Then I will be talking about recent evidence from the pandemic and directions for future work. So again, very briefly at a glance, gender inequalities are rife despite decades of progress, both in the labor market and in education. And at the cost of some oversimplification, the views about the factors of remaining gender inequalities can be broadly summarized under 2 umbrellas. One is about gender differences in traits. So one possibility is that men and women have different skills and psychological traits that drive different educational choices, different labor market outcomes. So in this case, gender inequalities would be a manifestation of gender differences in traits. The other view is that men and women are similar in most relevant dimensions, but they face different opportunities and constraints. For example, these constraints might be related to work-life balance considerations, stereotypes, gender norms, and other similar factors. Now, just very briefly, existing evidence on differences in traits, there is a large research there. For example, there is a large body of most experimental work investigating gaps in self-confidence, risk-taking behavior, social behavior. So one can argue that all those traits might interfere with labor market success if those traits are differently present among men and women. But despite widely held beliefs that men and women differ in these traits, there are some meta-analyses that have shown that differences are relatively small and also they're context dependent. So in this literature, I've done some work myself with Irena Bandiera, Nikki Parrott, and Michelle Rao. So we've done a meta-analysis of recent experimental work that researched gender differences in overconfidence. And this graph here basically represents the main results of our study. So the green bar represents the level of overconfidence for men and women. So you can see that for men here, up here, and for women up here, both estimates are to the right of this zero vertical line, meaning that both men and women tend to overstate their performance by about 0.4 to 0.5 of a standard deviation. And on these green estimates, you can see that the confidence interval is very small. So there is a very high precision. Then there is a different way to compute those estimates and confidence intervals, which is represented by these very large sort of red bars. The difference between the green and the red bars is that the green estimates assume that each study in the meta-analysis identifies a universal global phenomenon. So each additional study that we can bring to the pool is making our knowledge a lot more precise. The red estimates instead allow for the fact that different studies can indeed identify very different phenomena, different contexts, different individuals, different questions, which means that perhaps the precision that we have is a lot lower than we would think. So if we take into account this kind of uncertainty and we look at the gender gap of confidence, in this figure here, you can see that the gender gap is indeed not significantly different from zero. So in a sense, this literature has found quite a bit of evidence of gender differences in overconfidence. There has been a paper presented this morning in the labor market and gender session. But in a sense, the effects that are found are quantitatively quite small and also they're context dependent. So what I'm going to do for the rest of this discussion of gender inequalities is really mostly focusing on differences in barriers. Now, when we talk about barriers to gender equality, we very naturally think about work-life balance consideration, for example, because women remain the main providers of childcare, and this naturally sets limits to the labor market involvement. Now, motherhood has a clear detrimental impact on female earnings. So I can show you some data here for the UK and the US. What this graph shows you, it comes from a paper by Cleven, Landay, and co-authors. This shows the well-known motherhood penalty. So on the horizontal axis, the graph shows the years from childbirth. So time 0 represents the year of the birth of the first child. Before birth, you can see that the earnings of mothers and fathers are all sitting on top of each other. So before births, mothers and fathers have earnings on exactly the same trajectory. After birth, things start changing. So the solid lines represent the earnings for women in the US and in the UK respectively, and the dashed lines represent the earnings for men. As you can see, birth is very much a non-event for fathers because paternal earnings are highly affected by birth, while the arrival of children generates a sharp, persistent, and basically permanent fall in female earnings. This graph here refers to the UK and the US, but similar graphs can be done by other countries, even countries with very generous family policies. So this kind of motherhood penalty doesn't seem to be completely linked to different institutional scenarios across countries. Sorry. Okay. Now, one interesting fact is that the gendered roles upon childbirth are also relatively unrelated to the relative earnings potential of spouses. Even mothers who used to be the breadwinners in the household before childbirth do experience a sharp fall in their earnings after birth. So the important thing that one should investigate here is really what are the channels for this motherhood penalty. So one key channel, for example, is the demand for job flexibility. So the idea is that mothers may look for job characteristics like flexible hours, part-time working, short commutes that might not be especially conducive to earnings growth and might be penalized in higher earning careers. And then, of course, the other explanation has to do with possibly prescriptive norms and stereotypes. Now, on the demand for flexibility, the narrative is indeed rich and widespread. So any survey about gender inequalities would talk about these differential impacts of the demand for flexibility for men and women. But I would like to argue here that the evidence is not so abundant. So there's probably less than a handful of studies that investigate the causal impact of flexibility on the gender pay gap. So there is some work by Mass and Palais that shows that women value opportunities to work from home and also opportunities to control their work schedules more than men, especially so if they have children. But on the other hand, those traits like working from home and control over work schedules vary very little by gender. So the contribution to the gender gap is very small, like less than 2%. There is also evidence that women value short commutes more than men. And going for a short commute typically has an associated penalty in terms of the jobs that you can consider. And indeed, the paper by Barbanchon, Roulet, and Ratelot has found that this can explain up to 14% of the gender pay gap, but this is not limited to people with children. So this doesn't speak directly to the motherhood penalty. And finally, there is a very interesting paper by Melanie Wasserman that looks at medical specialties in the US medical schools. And she finds that specialties that introduce caps to weekly hours were able to attract more female residents. And the resulting gap in working hours explained about 11% of the physicians in the gap. But again, these are mostly people that still don't have children. So there's very little that speaks directly to the motherhood penalty. The other kind of story that is typically invoked in order to understand remaining gender gaps has to do with the role of norms and social prescriptions. So this is really about what is appropriate or inappropriate for men and women to do. And the reason why it becomes natural to think about the role of norms is that if parenthood and long-run culture would not be a distinctively female issue if gender roles were equalized within the household. So perhaps one needs to look within the household to understand what factors prevent an equal allocation of time. And this is where really gender norms come naturally to mind. So one may think, for example, there are identity costs and benefits to taking certain actions. If a family is sticking to the male breadwinner model, this family, both the man and the woman in the family, might experience an utility loss in the case in which the woman will become the breadwinner. There might be intrinsic consideration, there might be social image concerns, but there is by now quite a bit of evidence that is showing that gender norms do have an impact on the allocation of time. So here, just for all, even in high income countries, there is quite a bit of evidence of the importance of stereotypes. And this vignette here that I've put on the screen, probably some of you might remember it from the early days of the pandemic. This was put up during the first lockdown. So this was the way in which the government was advising people to stay home and save lives. And then given that the content of this vignette was recognized to be relatively sexist, then it was taken down after a short time. So as you can see here in the first little image, you can see a family relaxing on the sofa. In the second one, there's a woman holding a baby, so doing some kind of baby care. In the third one, there's a woman doing some homeschooling and childcare. And in the fourth one, there's a woman doing chores. And even there is some suggestion about the intergenerational mobility, because in this fourth picture, there is a little girl helping the mother with chores, but there's no little boys doing that. So in a sense, in a nutshell, this is representing what gender norms can do to the allocation of working time. And this figure here that I'm showing now represents the correlation between the sort of conservative content of gender norms and the extent of the motherhood penalty. So on the horizontal axis, what this graph shows is the percentage of the population in each of these 6 countries that agrees with the statement that women with children under school age or in school should stay at home instead of working in the market. So the more you move to the right, the more conservative the society would be. And on the vertical axis, there is the long-run child penalty in earnings. So before I was showing the long-run penalty for the US and the UK, the US and the UK are here, with a level of sort of agreement with this conservative norm between 25 and 30%, and motherhood penalties between 30 and 45%. If you move to the left to Scandinavia, Scandinavian countries have less gender norms in terms of whether or not women should work in the market. So the norms are less conservative, and also the motherhood penalty is smaller, but definitely is still still relatively high and far from zero. So we're talking about 20 to 25%. And at the other end of the spectrum, there are German-speaking countries like Germany and Austria, in which the percentage of people agreeing with gender norms is very high, and the motherhood penalty is between 50 and 60%. So there is a clear smoking gun about the importance of gender norms for female labor market outcomes. Now, what I'm going to talk about next is really whether there is something that can be learned from what we have witnessed during the COVID pandemic. Now we nearly have two full years of data. I've been talking about the importance of the organization of work, for example, work flexibility. I've been talking about the importance of gender norms. So perhaps one can learn lessons from the temporary but unprecedented changes that were brought about by COVID to family life and office life as well. So let me just start with this very broad evidence on changes in employment rates. I'm going to show several graphs for 4 different types of individuals. So this is about changes in employment rate for men with children, the blue solid line, women with children, the red solid line, and then men without children and women without children, the corresponding dashed lines. So you can see in the UK, 0 initially is the benchmark level of employment rate for all these people that was normalized to 0. As you can see, during the pandemic, there was hardly any change to employment rates because most adjustments in the UK took place through the furlough scheme, and people on furlough were, nominally speaking, still employed. Now, of course, the picture would be completely different if we were looking at the US scenario. So in the US, there was a sharp drop in employment rates for all 4 categories considered, and especially so for women, whether or not they have children. Now, with the gradual recovery, of course, a lot of those employment losses were reabsorbed, but women were, especially mothers, were always lagging behind men in going back to the pre-pandemic employment level. So the UK and the US experience were very different in terms of job loss. As I was saying before, most of the job adjustment in the UK was taking place through the furlough scheme. So this figure here represents the proportion of people who were ever furloughed using the Understanding Society COVID waves between January 2020 and September 2021. So there was a very strong increase in the furlough rate. And then you can see that both the initial increase and whatever was happening afterwards with further lockdowns and further adjustments was very similar between men and women. So the incidence, the arrival of furlough was very similar. What indeed was fairly different was the probability to remain in furlough. So once people were furloughed, women had a higher probability to remain in furlough. So especially if they had children, there was a gap of about 2.5 percentage points in the proportion of men and women with children that were furloughed at each point in time. And the interesting piece of evidence is that if you distinguish this, the cases of furlough according to the nature of the jobs that were done by these people, and you look at occupations that were not doable from home here on the left, and occupations that instead were doable from home, there are some gender differences there. So for example, in the occupations that were not doable from home, as one would imagine, the furlough rate was relatively high and also very similar across categories of people. If one looks at occupations that were indeed doable from home, then there is a very large change, a very large difference between fathers and mothers. So for mothers, whether or not they were working in occupations that were doable or not doable from home, the probability of being furloughed was very similar. So perhaps it wasn't driven by the nature of the job, but it was driven by other factors, presumably family factors, which is why some people have been talking about furlough for personal reasons, people asking to be put on furlough because they had caring responsibilities in their household. This doesn't seem to happen for men, but it does happen for women. In terms of working hours, it really depends the way in which we look at changes in hours. If one looks at absolute changes in hours, you can see that, especially at the beginning, mothers had slightly smaller changes in working hours than fathers, while with the second lockdown, it was the other way around. Now, typically, as mothers and fathers have different working hours at baseline, this implied a much bigger change, proportional change in working time for mothers than for fathers. So in proportional terms, mothers were working less in the market. But at the same time, as it was pointed out by several real-time surveys, mothers were working more in the household. The data here represent childcare time. So pre-pandemic, if you use time use data for 2014, 2015, these are the latest waves of time use surveys for the UK, you can see that men with children were doing on average 7.5 hours per week, and women were doing more than twice as much, about 17 hours per week. And then these are the pandemic months. As you can see, the total volume of childcare has gone up enormously. Men started to do about 15 hours per week, and women were doing about 27, 28 hours per week. And then this has come down a little bit, but not dramatically. This data, unfortunately, end in January 2021, which is the last wave when Understanding Society collects data on hours of childcare. So as you can see, women were doing a lot more childcare during the pandemic, but it was always the case. Women were always doing a lot more childcare even before the pandemic. So proportionally, perhaps, the heavier burden of childcare fell in according to the pre-pandemic proportions were already equal to start with. One important thing about the incidence of childcare is that the gap in the childcare hours is pretty much unaffected if one controls for the working status of individuals. So whether or not, for example, the mother was out of work or the father was out of work or whoever of them was furloughed, the differential in childcare hour was very similar across parents. And then I'm going to present some other evidence here on the organization of work. This is the proportion of people who were working from home, both before and after the pandemic, before, during, and after the pandemic. So January 2020 is before the pandemic. About 30% of individuals were working from home sometimes. So this doesn't mean that we're doing it most of the time, but sometimes they were working from home. And then, of course, this number increased a lot during the pandemic. As you can see, again, there are very strong differences between mothers and fathers here. If you look at people who were doing it all the time, not just sometimes, this was initially very close to zero. It went up to nearly 40%, again, with very little differences between mothers and fathers. What was different between mothers and fathers was the incidence of other kind of flexible work arrangements over and above working from home. So these were always so much larger for mothers and for fathers, even before the pandemic. And this mostly has to do with shorter worker hours or annualized hours. So again, there doesn't seem to be a huge difference during the pandemic that we hadn't observed before. Now, what is kind of more important here is understand what we can expect moving forward, especially if we can learn some valuable lessons from the pandemic for reducing gender inequalities in the future if those inequalities are linked to different demands for work flexibility. So before COVID, there was very little working from home in the UK. And there is an interesting survey of UK employers that asked them about their views about flexible working, smart working, working from home. And like 85% of employers and managers were saying that working from home simply doesn't work. It just introduces a lot of organizational complications. And now we know what's been happening for nearly 2 years. It seems that we've learned quite well to work from home and not from our offices 9 to 5. So now there is indeed quite a lot of work arguing that working from home will stick, and most workplaces are indeed adopting hybrid arrangements. So this is both on the employer and on the employee side. There is very clear expectations that some of the working from home habits will remain. Now, in terms of expectations, the UK data are relatively rich because we know at each point in time during the pandemic what this representative and understanding society sample thought, expected about working from home in the future. So for example, you can see here on the left that since June 2020, almost the totality of UK employees expected to work from home at least sometimes in the future. Almost 100%, men and women, women without children. Of course, if you look at the proportion who were thinking to always work full time, was a lot smaller. But again, there is very little difference between men and women. So there is this idea of hybrid work that is probably part of our expectations, but for the UK, there isn't really much evidence of gender differences. For the US here, there is a little bit more evidence of a difference between men and women. So this paper, by Nick Bloom and co-authors, reports information on how many days employees would like to work from home after the pandemic. So as you can see here, men want to do a little bit more than 40%, so typically 2 days a week. Women do a little bit more, would like to do a little bit more, nearly 2.5 days per week. So women would like to do a little bit more than men, but relatively similar. What is kind of interesting is that if you ask the same question among employers would like employee to only do 1 day from home, typically 20%, and 4 days in the office. So slight gender differences, but here probably the most important differences between the employees and the employers. Now, what can we learn about the career impacts of working from home? So far, as I was saying before, there is a really rich narrative about the cost of the demand for flexibility by men and women. And if men and women have different demands, they may pay different costs in terms of compensating differentials associated to the flexibility. And the sort of optimistic idea could be that the forced experimentation that we have seen with working from home, flexible work arrangement during COVID may teach us ways to reduce the penalty typically associated to non-standard form of work. So it might be the case that the penalty that we have observed in the past could be, for example, the result of inertia, lack of imagination on how to do things differently. So there might be something in this direction. There's also clear evidence of reduced significance of distance with working from home and hybrid work arrangement, and in particular, working from home can erode employer monopoly power. So for example, a very recent job market paper by Nikhil Datta estimates that workers' distaste for commute explains about 1/3 of the markdown of wages below the productivity in the UK. But there's really a lot of open questions here. So first of all, to what extent will high-profile jobs will be doable from home? Is there a value to presentism? So is there a value to be physically present in the workplace? And are there costs to be paid for not being present most of the time for different kinds of people? And here I'm going to quote the evidence from two very recent pieces of research. One is a paper by Nick Bloom and co-authors. It's a very interesting paper that shows evidence from a randomization exercise. So this is an experiment from a large multinational firm with headquarters in Shanghai, who introduced a hybrid working from home scheme. So in the scheme, the control group were back in the office 5 days a week, and the treatment group had the option of work from home for 3 days a week. And then this firm had a very fine-grained method for assessing performance every 6 months. So with the performance data tell that there was almost no impact whatsoever on the performance of employees, whether or not they were in smart working, and no impact at all on promotions. But there were improved views about working from home productivity. So people typically agreed that working from home worked better than they imagined. And most importantly, the quit rate fell by more than 1/3 among the population of employees, especially so among people who especially value working from home opportunities. And also sickness leave fell by 12%. So overall, there are no detrimental impacts on performance and beneficial impacts on attrition or lack of attrition, let's say. And then a kind of interesting dissenting voice is this very recent paper by Cullen and Perez-Julia that looks at the importance of informal personal interactions at work. So the idea of this paper is that formal interacting at work, for example, interacting with your manager, can give you the possibility to showcase your ability and can be better conducive to signaling and promotion within your team. So what this paper does, it looks at a large Asian bank and the data collected tell whether individuals were smokers or non-smokers. And the hypothesis of the paper is that people who smoke and need to take breaks from their desk in order to smoke, then they interact together. So what does it happen when employees tend to interact with their managers because both the employee and the manager are a smoker and they take a break in the street in order to smoke? So what the paper finds is that when an individual is exogenously allocated to a smoking manager, if this individual is a smoker, they would see over time during the next 10 quarters, they would see an increase in their wages, an increase in their pay grade related to a higher rate of promotion, to a faster career progression. And this career progression within those 10 quarters amount to about 15% wage differential with respect to the non-smokers. When the non-smokers are sort of associated to smoking managers, they don't get anything because they don't spend together time smoking. So again, this is very much, we could say that probably the jury is still out on whether there is a clear role of physical presence at work. But this is really just to give you some two sides of the story, the positive and the negative side. So the other point that I will briefly touch upon and then conclude, as I was saying before, we can learn both in terms of their organizational work, and maybe there is also something that we can learn about the possible evolution of gender norms, which seem to be quite important in the allocation of time between men and women. So what I'm showing you here is the allocation of childcare before and during COVID. From the time use data I was showing you before, I was showing you the averages for men and women before and after COVID. And that was, we were seeing that there was always a very large differential between men and women, but during COVID, everything was at a higher level. What I'm showing here is a slightly different statistic. It's basically telling which of the parents, or maybe other individuals outside the family, are mostly in charge of childcare. So the graph on the left, the pie chart on the left, refers to 2016-2017. At that time, you would see that in the vast majority of households in the UK, about 57% of households, the mother was mainly in charge of childcare. Then 40% did it more or less shared on equal terms, and less than 3% had the fathers in charge of childcare. During COVID, things have changed quite a bit. So the pie chart on the right refers to spring 2020. So the proportion of families with the mother most in charge stayed more or less unchanged, from 57% to 58%. But what increased enormously in relative terms was the share of family who had the father in charge of childcare. So from 3% in 2016 to 18% in 2019. So there is a relatively large minority of UK households in which the traditional gender roles have basically tipped towards having the father in charge of childcare. Why do we think this is important? Well, in history, we have noticed that gender norms evolve only very slowly. And the most important factor that is conducive to the evolution of gender norms is being exposed to something being done differently. For example, being exposed to fathers that take paternity leave, there can be clear effects on that. Being exposed to women who enter male-dominated sectors during World War II due to male mobilization rates. So this is one particular case of exposure to non-traditional gender roles. There is this kind of relatively large minority of households in which gender roles have completely flipped. So the jury is out on whether this may have more effects in the longer run. Okay, it's still early to tell because at the moment we don't have microdata on the allocation of childcare in UK households. So the latest microdata refer to January 2021. But what I'm representing here is the microdata before and during COVID. So before and during COVID, fathers were doing about 40% of childcare. Of course, during COVID, the volume was higher, but the share of fathers was more or less the same. And then here, the third bar comes from aggregate data published by the ONS. You can see after COVID, if anything, the contribution of fathers have gone down to nearly 30%. So we don't really see any smoking gun that the average allocation of working time is changing towards becoming more equal. But again, these are aggregate data. So one really needs a distribution to see whether there is still this kind of large minority of households in which the change was permanent rather than temporary. So this is where our research is going next. Okay, so I would like to conclude. Very happy to discuss any of these points within the panel. The pandemic implied unprecedented reorganization of work, both at home and in the workplace. And then, of course, the key question here is, will the impacts of that be gender biased? I argue that evidence to date is fairly limited on this because the intention to work from home, at least in the data that we have for the UK, doesn't seem very different between men and women. And the evidence that we have about working from home patterns and hybrid work patterns doesn't seem to be detrimental, fortunately, to productivity. So at least to date, there isn't really a smoking gun that we should worry about hybrid work arrangements and gender inequalities. Of course, there has been a major impact on the volume of unpaid work, as I was showing before. Women on average were more affected, but then, as I said, there was a reversal of gender roles in some cases. So the key thing here is really monitoring whether this will imply some small evolving norms in those families. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barbara, for a really interesting and very informative keynote talk. I am going to hand over straight away to Cristiano Cantore for his comments, and we'll hear all the commentators first, and then we'll open up to the audience, both in person and virtual, for your questions. So start preparing them.
Thanks. Thanks a lot for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And thanks, Barbara, for the very insightful presentation. I have to start by saying usual disclaimer applies. Whatever I say is only my view and not the view of the Bank of England. Right, so I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes focusing my discussion on gender equality in the labor market and COVID, putting a little bit more emphasis on productivity, which I think is going to be complementary to what Barbara spoke about. And this discussion is going to be divided into two pieces. First, I'm going to just give a summary or a snapshot of two styled facts about labor force participation and employment, mainly drawing on Barbara's presentation and other people's work. And I'm going to argue that it looks like that even if we agree that this can be is probably a she session, it was not as bad as the headlines were saying at the beginning of the onset of the pandemic. And I'm going to focus on US and UK in this talk. On the other hand, though, if we look at productivity, there is evidence of a large drop in women's productivity. And this is mainly, as Barbara was mentioning, due to a greater impact of childcare duties. And then in the last couple of slides, the last few minutes, I'm going to try to discuss what should we expect going forward, especially because now we have lots of evidence, both from employees and employer, that working from home is here to stay. And so we need to think about what would be the long-lasting effect, especially when we think about the effect on productivity, the amount of hours of work and earnings, and the gender pay gap. Right, so what do we know about? So as I said, I'm going to try to summarize my take of the literature, especially when we look about employment and labor force participation during the pandemic. This is taken by a very recent, very nice paper by Claudia Godin in the Brookings paper of economic activities. And this shows the labor force participation of female workers in the US. And basically what she mentioned is that, what she shows here is that it's true that there's been a large drop in employment in the US, and there was no such a furlough scheme like we've seen in the UK. But in general, the real story, as she says, is that women have remained in the labor force and stayed in this job as much as they could. And so this, and she discusses a lot comparison between headlines, for example, in the newspaper and in surveys at the beginning of the pandemic, because the estimate of this drop was much larger, so was much smaller than what was expected. This is a picture for the UK. We have a similar story, although this is employment from the ONS, and there's a very nice paper also by Barbara and co-authors, but obviously here we don't see the impact of furlough scheme, which is important, okay? So if you just look at aggregate data for employment, there seems to be no much difference, or actually there is a bigger drop from men than from females. But what about productivity? So I'm a macro labor economist, so when I start looking at all this literature, I ask myself, do we have evidence of what has happened? And I found, also there is a bias, we are all academics here, but I found some very nice papers by colleagues. One of them is focusing on the amount of working paper produced in economics. This is by Amano Patiño and co-authors at the University of Cambridge. What they did, they looked at the amount of working papers produced by economists before and during the pandemic. So the blue line shows the amount of working paper in the MBR and CPR working series pre-pandemic, and the gray line is basically an average, which you can see that you have around 21% were female authors. And then and this shows, including the 2020, that there's been no major change during the pandemic in terms of the amount of paper written by female authors. But what about, I mean, if we all been there at the onset of the pandemic, everybody wanted to work on COVID, and there has been an explosion of COVID paper, and they looked specifically at the papers that were looking at COVID and economics, and there was a big differences. So only 12% of the total number of these working papers had female authors. And they claim, and they show this as evidence of a big drop in productivity, especially when it comes to timely and very hot topic research. A very similar work did the same, but for the all social sciences in the US. And here, basically, the blue line, the one on top, is the amount of preprints by male authors. This is sort of an event study, so 12 months before and after the lockdown. The vertical line shows the beginning of the lockdown in the US. The red line is the amount of papers by female authors. You can see that there is no difference for female authors, but there is a large difference for male. So, and what they estimate here is that during the 10 weeks of the first lockdown, female academics' productivity dropped by about 14%. There is also, I found lots of evidence about declining productivity in many other occupations and industries. Why is that? And this is a picture taken from Barbara's slides, is the unequal incidence of childcare. And not just childcare, I've read lots of also anecdotes and data about elderly care. So daughters were also disproportionately affected by taking care of their parents. And there is a paper by the Institute of Physical Study that has estimated a big drop in productivity, especially for if you're working from home with young children. As if you have children, you can imagine. Right, so what about going forward? How can we, what are the lessons that can we learn, and what actually, I mean, I'm not gonna give any solution, but I'm gonna focus on some of the unanswered questions, research questions, which I think we should focus in the near future. So, as I said, working from home is here to stay. We have lots of evidence from the employer's point of view. We have a survey from the ONS and a survey of the decision market panel of the Bank of England that shows that firms expect a permanent increase in working from home in between 1 to 2 days a week. Similar surveys, again for the ONS or Nick Bloom and co-authors, shows that workers also expect to be working from home more in the future. And more specifically, it seems that older workers and female and mothers prefer more flexibility. So the question is, what will be the impact of this thing on the gender pay gap, labor supply, and productivity? And because we can think of channels moving in different direction. And I'm going to finish by speculating a little bit here. I mean, this is not necessarily my area of expertise of research, but I try to think about how various channels could affect this motherhood penalty, which Barbara was also talking about. So the fact that having a child reduces dramatically your hours of work and earnings. And so what would be the effect? So I was thinking about there could be positive effect that reduce this motherhood penalty through the fact that more flexibility in the households could increase the mother's working hours, and also easing the pressure through enhanced childcare with fathers. As Barbara was saying, we don't have definitive evidence on this, but there seems to be that some of the data shows that there was a relative increase in the percentage of fathers taking care of their children, and also through the fact that they have larger flexibility. But again, we have negative effects. So an increase in the motherhood penalty could be driven by decreasing productivity. We still don't know. I mean, the data on productivity were about the first lockdown when nursery and schools were closed. So we don't know what would be the impact of working from home on productivity during, let's say, normal times. But there are pros and cons in that. Also, it's not obvious if high-profile jobs are doable from home, and what is the value of personal interaction for career progression. That's it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. And let me hand straight over to Rain, please.
Thanks so much, Marina. And it's great to be here and great to have the Royal Economic Society, I think, not just have this discussion, but I think showcase some of the research that has been done around gender during the pandemic. What I thought I could do is just to give a bit of a perspective around businesses and how they saw sort of issues around gender during the pandemic and some of the economic support that was put in place, and then talk a little bit about hybrid working and what might sort of stick and what might that mean going forward. And I have to say, I am also joined by one of my daughters who is here in the audience. So I'm trying to live, I suppose, some of that, bringing a more diverse perspective. And I think when we talk about the challenges of homeschooling and working from home during the pandemic, I'm trying not to have post-traumatic stress disorder, as I'm sure many of you can sympathize. But I don't know what others have found. I found it's a bit like childbirth. I only remember the nice bits, like going for a run in the morning before I started work with one of my daughters and the kids playing happily out in the sunshine. Not all the moments that I was sort of feeding biscuits on the other side of the laptop endlessly to children who needed my attention, but I couldn't give it. And I suppose that's one of the places I would start as well. I think one of the challenges of looking at the pandemic only to make some kind of inferences long term about productivity is I think there's a real risk, because what we had during the pandemic was many people, not just women, but also men, doing two jobs at once. So they were performing childcare and trying to do work as well. So I think that will obviously have an impact on productivity. And I would also say from some of the businesses' point of view as well, even if they were in operational, so manufacturing, hospitality, and so many different businesses were also having to implement restrictions which they weren't operating under normal times. So I guess that's just one plea, I think, to academics out there to think about some of that when you're using it as a control study. But I think what's been really valuable about Barbara as well work is she's been looking at the sort of preferences and what people were doing and what happened with the furlough scheme and beyond. And I think that stuff has been really, really critical. I think just from, at the CBI, so during the pandemic, we talked to businesses across all sectors, across all regions in the UK, and we were really trying to talk to businesses about the challenges they were facing, and then also talk to policymakers around how they were designing some of the policies, and particularly the furlough scheme, and how that needed to be adapted to work well for both sides, because I think everyone's sort of North Star, I think, during that crisis was how do we keep as many people in employment as possible. And one of the things actually businesses themselves were pushing for flexibility, or for it to be clear in the guidance on how they could use the furlough scheme, that they could use it for people who had childcare responsibilities. And I think it was quite important that people did have the flexibility to use furlough. Just for that reason, it kept a lot of working parents in work who otherwise might have been forced into tough choices. And I think you can see the benefits of that, because the vast majority of people who were put on furlough have moved back into work and back into employment. I mean, they were technically, obviously, employed throughout that period of time, but have moved back into a job. And so I think you see the real success of that policy. But I think that flexibility of being able to use it to help working parents was particularly important, and was something that both employees and employers were asking for. And I think another element of the furlough scheme as well, where the flexibility was important, is as the economy started to reopen, originally furlough was designed as an on-off switch. You were either on furlough and therefore could not be at a place of work, or it didn't, or you had to be in work. But what they decided was that you could use it flexibly, so you could come back. If you were a full-time worker, you could come back into the workplace 3 days a week and work from home, or be at home 2 days a week not working. And that flexibility was quite important, because it meant that as the economy reopened, whether you were a manufacturer, for instance, and you only had demand able to keep the production open 3 days a week, you were able to keep your whole workforce in employment, full-time employment. So I think that flexibility was really important. And if there's maybe lessons for how policy is designed in future, thinking how you have flexibility within some of these schemes, I think is really important. I think one of the things we may want to touch on in discussion, which isn't covered in some of the research that's been presented so far, is just thinking about self-employment as well. Obviously, here a lot of the research has been focused on people in employment, but there was a lot of challenges in self-employment, which actually particularly affected men, and a lot of men in self-employment did lose their jobs quite early on their work early on in the pandemic. If you think about taxi drivers and many of that, and there are also those who were owner directors as well, and people often think about plumbers as being the sort of typical kind of self-employed. But I think in the conversations I had during the pandemic, there were a lot of women as well in that position, who might have had, a swim instructor who was teaching lessons at a local leisure centre, where she would have a lot of self-employed swim instructors working for her. So I think that was one of the things as well during the pandemic. There were some voices that weren't always heard in the media. There was a lot of focus, I think, around pubs and support. And I do like a pub. It was important we supported pubs through the pandemic. But one of the things, as we were having conversations, was making sure that we were also talking about hairdressers, nail salons, and many of the and people providing gym and childcare facilities for people, because some of those people didn't really have as much voice when policy was being designed. So I think those were just some of my sort of overall reflections about how policy was being designed, and that importance of flexibility and keeping parents in work. I then just wanted to just say a few reflections around hybrid working and what I think will happen going forward, and what are some of the things that I learned during the pandemic. So I think two things that's really important to make the distinction, which I think both Barbara and Cristiano did as well, is that there's a distinction between flexibility in working patterns, so part-time work, compressed hours, all of that, and then working from home, which of course can happen, can be a choice for those in full-time work or in any other different working pattern. But sometimes in policy discussions, they get conflated together. But I think it is important to distinguish between them. And I think what we do know, I really agree with what Cristiano was saying, that hybrid working is here to stay. I think, and of course, those are in the roles where it's relatively easy to do that from home. So it's around 40%, I always think, roughly, in terms of roles across the economy. So I think we need to recognize not all occupations can be done from home. And many funny TikTok videos I'm sure you saw during the pandemic of people trying to be an air steward or stewardess from home. Not everything can be done from home, but I think where it is possible, it certainly revolutionized or accelerated a real trend. So I think, first of all, from a business perspective and from some of the businesses I spoke to, it really did break down some of the stereotypes about working from home. And I say this as someone who was a hybrid worker going into the pandemic, is that I think because suddenly everyone was doing it from home, it really tested some of the systems people had as to how effectively it could be done. So if you think about financial services, basically moved overnight to providing all of their services from home. And so it really tested contingency arrangements, which actually stood up really well. So, and we also did helped to run some surveys for the LSE's CEP around digital adoption during the pandemic. And there was an acceleration, particularly around SMEs, on adopting new digital technologies, which really helped that work from home. But I think it just changed people's perception about being productive working from home, even moving aside from when people had to do sort of two jobs at once. But I think people could see there was so much you can do if you use technology well to work from home. But I think there's a big difference between an enforced work from home and also doing it on a permanent basis all the time. Secondly, I think it also opened up really better conversations around mental health. And that wasn't just about working from home, but it was a consequence of the pandemic and what everyone was going through. A lot of businesses now, are much more conscious about ways in which they need to keep their employees connected, and just some of the challenges that people went through during the pandemic has made a lot more companies talk about mental health and how to preserve well-being of their employees, whether they're in the workplace or whether they're working from home. I think a third thing that businesses are thinking about at the moment is also just some of what we're seeing here now. What happened to their workforce during the pandemic? And as they move to more hybrid working over the long term, who is coming back into the office? Who is not coming back into the office? And what do they do to ensure that people are being treated equally and that people have the same opportunities for promotion and for advancement, even if they are working from home or whether they're in the office? I think there's a much more sort of healthy and open conversation about that. And I think finally, and I guess this is where I do think over the long term it gives individuals more choice. And I think one of the benefits in the UK context at the moment is because we have a relatively tight labour market, actually I think individuals have more bargaining power. I would agree with that in terms of their ability to work from home, because 90% of workers want to have at least some working from home. But in the context of a tighter labour market, it's easier to use that to be able to get some of that in this sort of outcome of jobs. And I think that does mean we're able to have a more inclusive workforce in terms of both in terms of location, but in terms of working pattern. So yeah, just in sum, I think it's great to see this sort of work. I'm really glad that we're having the conversation. I think having that flexibility in policy and thinking about some of the nuances of gender throughout those really important. And as we think to a more hybrid form of working, how we ensure that everyone has that chance for promotion and makes the best of that greater flexibility, I think is something it would be good to see from all sides.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rain. And let me hand over to our last discussion, Giovanni, before we open up.
Okay. I will be quick in a way. I'll focus on a couple of points also because I can see that some questions are already coming online. What I'll try to do is to focus on, to reflect on a couple of pieces of evidence that have been presented by Barbara and Cristiano, and try to draw out some policy implications. I mean, it would be very high-level policy implications. So, what kind of public policy can emerge out of these pieces of evidence? And so, I apologize for that at the outset. It won't be specific policy ideas. So, the first one is that I do wonder. I mean, the whole issue about gender inequality and the impact of gender on gender inequality in the labor market in period of crisis, is quite relevant, and as is linked as well to the evidence that Barbara showed about this time is different, and it made me reflect that actually I wonder whether we are living in a period of crisis in the sense, in the literally sense of the word, so crisis is a turning point, because I do wonder whether actually it's been, the turning point has been during the great financial crisis, because we have been living, thinking about it, in subsequent period of crisis since then. We had the great financial crisis, but immediately after that we had the sovereign debt crisis. And in fact, actually, when originally the impact on gender inequality in the labor market as a result of the great financial crisis was assessed, the major conclusion was that it was a man session, not a she session. But actually, once you take into account fully the sovereign debt crisis and the fiscal consolidation that followed, once you took account of the combined effect of industry and occupational segregations, and the fiscal consolidation policies, then the actual narrative around man session was contradicted. So I do wonder whether that might be the case as well now, in the sense that, as I mentioned, the great financial crisis, then the sovereign debt crisis, and then we moved on into Brexit, the supply chains, labor shortages, and now the pandemic, and now even a war in the middle of Europe. So I think it's not anymore crisis as a turning point, but I think that possibly the turning point happened quite 15 years ago, and what impact will have on gender equality will be quite relevant. So it's important, of course, to focus on the impact of COVID, but I think there is a bigger, wider picture in terms of crisis. Now, what does it mean in terms of policy? It's difficult to say, I think, but certainly I think one clear message is that if this interpretation of crisis is actually something that a turning point that happened 15 years ago is valid, in terms of policy, well, certainly this places the policymakers in a kind of responsive mode. So it's much more difficult to plan and to be forward-looking and strategic in addressing gender inequality, because you're always responding to a crisis that is followed by another crisis. And so it's quite difficult, I think, for policymakers to be forward-looking and strategic. Although at the same time, I mean, we can criticize what has been going on in the UK in that respect in terms of policy making, because you look at the effort in terms of addressing gender inequality, and there doesn't seem to be a specific focus on that. For instance, when you compare to the recovery and the resilience plan of the European Union, where each government, I think by last year, April 2021, had to present the recovery and resilience plan to bid for around 700 billion euros of resources. They had to explicitly refer to what they were doing on gender inequality. I think it was Article 25-28 of the recovery and resilience guidance of the European Union that explicitly referred countries to address gender inequality in the labor market. Another policy message implication that I think emerges from this interpretation of crisis as a longer period now is I think that they certainly need to have a more effective, in a way, monitoring governance, so institution system in place, particularly at the macroeconomic level, I think, so budget measures, monetary policy measures, they actually are effectively take into consideration distributional implications, and in particular, of course, given the topic, the gender impact of the policies. So there's the kind of immediate first reflection. A second reflection is on some of the evidence that is out there but has not been particularly referred to today, which is certainly the fact that the physical, psychological, and impact of the pandemic has been felt differently by different groups of women, not just by men as opposed to women, but by different groups of women. So we know, for instance, that disabled women have suffered relatively more in terms of isolation, of health and well-being. At the same time, we know the ethnic minority women have it's quite well documented now, the higher risk of death or even work pressures are quite pronounced for them. So what does it mean in terms of actually policy? It certainly means that we need to look beyond averages. So it's certainly important to actually focus on gender, but it's also important to look at the intersectionality. So to look beyond averages. And we know very well now, it's well established that within group inequalities are much more pronounced than between group inequalities. And therefore it's important to understand what happens within certain groups of women as opposed to between men and women. So looking beyond averages, looking at the whole distribution and the distributional impacts is absolutely important in terms of policy. More specifically, this also suggests a focus on individual targeted approaches that actually look at individual circumstances, not just men or women. And it's certainly much more difficult, much more onerous, but it's very important. And I do wonder whether there are lessons that can be learned in this respect from, for example, from the disability policy agenda, where a much more individual approach is being developed over time, if you think about individual budgets and so on and so forth. So those are the two main kind of reflections on policies that I wanted to point out. Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanni. And now we are going to open up to both the virtual and in-person audience for comments and questions. You mentioned, Giovanni, there's something already in the virtual audience. Maybe we start from them this time.
Yes, there's one question. I think this is mostly for Cristiano, because it refers to the evidence on the part of working from home on productivity and the fact that it seems a little flimsy. So what's the best evidence on this question? One imagines that any causal impact varies greatly by task and the presence of children.
Yeah, no, that's spot on. I should have, this was, but there is definitely evidence that there is a negative effect on productivity, but that's linked to childcare. So we were talking about the first lockdown, nursery and school closed. And that's across the board. If you think about, obviously, if you were a nurse and you had to go to the hospital, you had other issues. But my question was, do we know what's the effect going forward? I suspect it's going to be very heterogeneous, depending on tasks, but we need to know if we want to inform policy. Because even from my own experience, some tasks, I perform them much better. I used to work a lot from home before. As an academic, but for example, staying the whole day in front of your computer listening to presentation for a conference, you fall asleep. It's much better to stay in a room. If I have to write a paper, it's much better to stay at home. So it depends on the composition, but that's exactly the point I wanted to make.
Thank you. Yes, questions in the audience? Do we have? Yes. Do we have anyone who's helping with that? No. Do you want me to? Okay.
Yeah, I can't do.
No, exactly.
Thank you very much. It's Tara Alice from McKinsey, but also on the RAS board. So first of all, huge thank you to all of you for being so nuanced and evidence-based. It's not at all the sort of type of debate we have had throughout the pandemic, where it's been often very partial, very much driven by what people want to believe rather than what the data tells us. And as you said, also quite reactionary, reacting to specific things rather than taking a step back. I wanted to ask all of you really sort of another taking a step back question. Earlier we heard Partha Dasgupta talk about wealth accounting and how we should be thinking about social welfare analysis as a way of helping governments make better decisions. But when I look at the guidance on how you should do social welfare analysis, I don't find shadow prices for gender equality, or I think equality, or any of the kind of stuff that we've been talking about today. And when I look at Treasury publications, they publish an okay thing at every budget, which shows you sort of distributional impacts by decile of households, but they do not publish impacts of women versus men, which would be a minimum requirement in my view, but even some more intersectional data, which surely is absolutely doable if they can do it by decile of household. So I'm interested in your views on whether there is potential, and if so, how, to bring these issues closer to the center stage of policymaking.
Thank you. Shall we collect? There was another question, and then get the panel to answer. I saw the hand up. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Jasmine, and I work for DIT, Department for International Trade. And my question is similar. So, I've looked into this topic before, and I found a lot of the research focuses mostly on the traditional definition of gender, and the gender definition tends to be focusing on the traditional binary, when obviously there's intersectionality, and people can fall into different groups, as Giovanni has mentioned. So do you know if there's any work being done to look into these, into more research that doesn't just look at from gender from a binary perspective, but also from a non-binary perspective as well? Because obviously people are differently affected by crisis. Yeah.
Thank you. Shall we get Barbara first, maybe, if you want to come back in and comment on your commentators, as well as start with the questions. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the comments, and so of course there is a lot to say in terms of, for example, productivity and policy. I mean, the point of productivity is really important, because if we just look at working hours in the office, in the market, in the household, etc., this doesn't really take into account the productivity component necessarily. And something that was interesting during the pandemic is that whatever little evidence we have from time use surveys has shown that given a certain amount of hours worked at home by mothers or fathers, mothers were having a lot more interruptions, presumably interruptions related to childcare or homeschooling than fathers, and that may fit into productivity. Being an editor at AJ and also managing the labor market program at CPR, this is kind of an interesting thing. I was receiving submissions, both submissions to the AJ and submissions of discussion paper to the CPR, and together with the other editors, both at CPR and at the AJ, we really asked the question, is it true that women are submitting fewer papers? I mean, of course, it's a very partial view of those two outlets. And we were seeing that so women, even before the pandemic, were submitting fewer papers. During the pandemic, the differential between men and women, at least for those two outlets, was very, very stable. So we didn't find evidence of bigger effects on female productivity. But again, it's a very, very small part of the work spectrum. We're talking about academics. So again, it's a very small group. On the questions that we had from the floor, it was a very interesting point about this idea of how should we bring this attention on gender inequalities to the forefront of policy. I mean, one important thing to notice is that when we talk about gender inequalities, of course, there is an equity aspect to that, about access to equal opportunities to men and women in the labor market and the educational system. But also there is an efficiency point related to that. So for example, if we accept the hypothesis that talent is equally distributed across gender, and then we see girls, for example, investing more in education than boys, I mean, there is no reason why one should mostly tap into one pool, for example, the male pool, to fill jobs in like financially rewarding careers or leadership positions. And so basically the result here is that mostly tapping into one pool may achieve a less efficient allocation of skills to jobs, so a less efficient allocation of talent. And I think that this is really the message that should be sent across in order to bring gender inequalities to the forefront of policy discussion. The other point about the non-binary definition of gender is, of course, very important. I'm afraid there is very little research that on this point, at least research that I'm aware of. Also, I mean, kind of slightly related, this whole research about, for example, the motherhood penalty or much of the research of gender inequalities typically looks at heterosexual couples. So we know very little about the penalty related to the arrival of children in homosexual couple. The little evidence that I know is that there is some specialization also within homosexual couples after birth, and the specialization seems to be related to the specialization pre-birth into labor market careers. So typically the spouse who was a high earner in the labor market is providing less of the childcare after birth. So there is some sort of specialization, but it seems less extreme than among heterosexual couples. But I'm afraid I don't know of other evidence on this.
Thank you, Barbara. Comments from the other panelists to these questions?
Yes, just a couple of comments on the use of distributional analysis in government. As you mentioned, you know, the government published the distributional analysis at the end of budget measures. At the back of the reports, you always find that. And it's done, of course, by household. So the size of the distribution of income distribution. And the reason that being a data issue, of course, also because most of the benefits are household-based, and therefore an household measure of income is taken into consideration. So that makes much more difficult to, of course, do an analysis by gender and looking at within the household, because you need personal income, which is available, but of course, you know, it's a step further, which in a way is a kind of justification for why it's not there. It requires more analysis, a different focus, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. The other aspects of the other question on the intersectionality, I mean, my feeling is really the government knows about this. The evidence, as I mentioned, that within group inequalities is much more pronounced than between group inequalities, well known to government, and actually he has informed in the past, I know for sure because I was also involved directly, he has informed in past, for instance, the Equality Act, or even you may know the reform of the various equalities commissions and the incorporation into the Equality and Human Rights Commission one, so it was exactly an attempt to actually be much more careful about the intersectionality and how different characteristics intersect. In the Equality Act, for instance, one of the first things was about the need to focus on social inequality, on socioeconomic class. That has not been taken forward, but that was exactly because once you look at within group inequality and you look at intersectional aspect, you want to know who actually the highly paid, to give an example in terms of pay, who are the highly paid women as opposed to the low paid women. Social class becomes quite an important variable. And so it's well known, this I think there's plenty of evidence already about the need to focus on that, on intersectionality because of that.
Thank you. Rain, did you want to?
Maybe just briefly, I think some great questions and comments. I think on the one around sort of social welfare, I mean, I don't think I've got brilliant solutions as to how we take it into account, but just a couple of reflections. I think during the COVID crisis, the one thing that it did highlight was just obviously social inequality, whether it was by gender or by race. And ethnicity. And I think the more that there is good research, looking into outcomes, and the more people ask, the more we ask the questions about policy, how is it affecting different groups? I think that is all for the better. And I think your question around non-binary and gender, I think is really, really important. I think the only thing I can offer from a sort of business angle is I think, gender pay gap reporting and I also, we certainly think that organizations should look at ethnicity as well and report their pay gaps associated with that. I think the challenge around non-binary is making sure we have enough of a sample size to be able to make the inferences. And so in a way that's going to take companies almost pooling some of their data. And so it feels like there's good research to be done around that, because I think understanding people's experience in work and how that relates to pay is really, really important. I think it's certainly right to ask the questions and try and think through what policies we can do to have better data to understand people's experience.
Okay. Now, if there are no more questions from the audience, because we have the Economic Journal keynote address, which will be broadcast again from this room at 3:00, I would propose that we stop the session now, thanking very much Barbara for bearing with her illness and with being virtually connected with us and giving us a wonderful keynote, and our panelists for being so helpful. So please, a round of applause for them.
Thank you very much for being so accommodating in this condition.
And we'll see you back in here at 3:00, both virtually and in person. Thank you very much.